Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Naomi Stokes, and I am a recent graduate from the Arts Administration and Culture Management program from Humber College, and I currently work as an administrative assistant at Lighthouse Immersive. I interned as a project coordinator at Mass Culture this past year, and that's how I know these lovely people. I will be emceeing today's event, Video Gaming and the Arts Sector, brought to you by Mass Culture in partnership with Gross Morn Music Festival. I am joining you today from Toronto, the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Métis, and the Anishinaabeg, including the Mississaugas of the Credit Nation. On behalf of the organizers of today's event, I would like to recognize and respect all recorded and unrecorded nations who cared for this land of Toronto, meaning where the trees meet the water. We honor the dish with one spoon treaty and our responsibility to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We are grateful for the opportunity to nurture the world of the arts and connect cultures and communities across this land, which is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. Today's session offers a convening format new to mass culture that they have coined Play Go Round. This method for gathering and sharing knowledge involves a more deepened approach, giving our three speakers different occasions to share information, listen to their colleagues, reflect, and maintain a level of curiosity in the subject matter. We are thrilled to have all of you take part in this knowledge journey, as today we will continue to navigate through this subject matter by having the speakers interview one another based on their thought pieces. You can watch the recordings of their thought pieces on Mass Culture's website. After this interview relay, you will be hearing from Luke Rees with an original poem informed by today's events. It is a pleasure for me to introduce to you today's speakers. Marie Leblanc Flanagan is an artist and consultant working in the playful spaces between people, especially related to connection and community. Marie co-founded the Imaginary Residency, an artist-run online residency. Weird Arts Initiatives, a nationwide nonprofit dedicated to encouraging, documenting, and connecting creative expression across Canada. And Drone Day, an international day for the celebration of experimental drone music and communities. Marie also co-organized Gaia, a 9-session online conference for 150 plus game curators around the world. Bart Simon is the co-founder and director of Miller Institute of Arts, Culture, and Technology, an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Concordia University in Montreal. His areas of expertise include game studies, science and technology studies, and cultural sociology. In the area of games, he works on diverse topics, ranging from embodied play and physical interfaces, playgrounds, the cultural politics of indie game development, and Minecraft modding cultures. His current research and liveness in immersive theatre and games is funded by the Social Science and Humanities Council of Canada. And lastly, Sara Brin, who is a business professional and art historian who specializes in previously unanticipated situations involving technology, the public, and organizational infrastructure. She's created programs, exhibitions, and publications for organizations like Autodesk, SFMOMA, British Council, MoCA Los Angeles, the European Union, and elsewhere. She cares about building just sustainable and inviting things. Over the next 45 minutes, our speakers will enter into an interview relay of some sorts. But during this time, while you're listening, keep an eye out on the chat and feel free to share your insights and respond to our questions for you, the audience. With that, I'd like to invite Marie and Bart to enter our virtual stage.
Hello, hello everyone. Wonderful to see you. I'm here today in Jojage, also known as Montreal, and I love the land acknowledgement. I'd also like to say that there's an ongoing crisis with the pipeline, and there are actions that people can do now to educate and to consider it. And in Montreal, we have an amazing group that is reparations, where settlers can give money to Indigenous people. And so if you're curious about that or have $50 to give someone today who needs medication, let me know and I'll pass on their contact to you. Yeah. Hi, Bart. Oh, you're muted, Bart, but I felt the presence of your voice.
First mistake of the day. Hi.
I'm so glad that I get to interview you. I'm delighted. And I loved your interview. And I want to start with a question. Just dive right into it. To you, what are the most interesting features or affordances of games specifically? So lots of arts people here, different backgrounds. What makes games interesting?
That's the heart of it already. Yeah, so this is a long debate, right? That's gone on forever about whether games get to be special. Is this a special medium, or is it a remediation of every other medium? And there's nothing special about games at all. I tend to, in one moment, I'm kind of agnostic. You know, games have elements of other media, film, even radio, the serial concept from television. People talk about it in terms of literature and everything else. But on the other hand, there's something I think almost more interesting about trying to find out what the special sauce is for something that might be called games. And it may not be in their media capacity at all. That is, what makes games interesting to me is the fact that they can't really exist without people playing them. So even though you can make a game just the same way as you can, make a piece of music, the game doesn't exist in the world in the same way a piece of music can. So even though for sure, music needs listeners or something along those lines, it still exists as a piece of music. A book that's written still exists as a book. The game only exists as software until it's played. The game itself doesn't doesn't come into existence until the act of playing. And this strikes me as being a particular, it's not unique to games, but it's certainly one of the key aspects of the medium, but it also means that like not all things that we call games necessarily have that property. But that's what I would isolate as like the key thing about games is that in order to exist, the audience, as it were, needs to play them. And maybe we can move from there.
Beautiful. Yeah. I mean, I want to move from there, from play to interactivity. I mean, you talked in your thought piece a lot about interactivity. I taught a workshop this morning on interactivity. It's very much on my mind. And I was specifically interested in the way that you talked about like weak interactivity versus strong interactivity. And I don't know, I'm curious. I would love to hear more because I felt, I don't know if other people felt this way, but I felt like a little bit of resistance to the idea that to maybe one being called weak, just that like interaction is like very complex. And I do agree that there's something very interesting going on when, and just for anyone who hasn't listened to the piece yet, this like weak or shallow interactivity would be, Bart used examples of like pressing a button, or I don't know, like you could even say starting a microwave or something like this. Whereas like stronger activity being more like sandboxy. Like, what do I want to do as a player? What are my goals? What am I dreaming of? Is that fair, Bart? Before I ask my question.
Sort of fair. So I use the language of strong and weak provocatively. In part, it's a term of art. It's a technical way of understanding different degrees of interactivity, so a range of choices, if you like. But from a sociological point of view, it's much deeper than that. It has to do with how kinds of systems can encourage players to imagine possibility spaces. So the stronger the interactivity, the more varied and more deep becomes the imagination of the player in terms of what they could do, what they want to do. And in fact, you could get that with the press of a single button. So a single button press can produce a lot of imaginative possibility space. But more often than not, pressing a button is linked to a single action. So we're used to it in sort of industrial modernity, you know, press a button to make a thing happen. And most games work that way. Press a button to make that a thing happen. Press W to go forward, press whatever to go that way. And that's all that that means. So that the range of imaginative action that comes from any interaction is kind of restricted by the instrumental character of that zone of interest. So that's weak in the sense of its imaginary, the space of imagination there. And you can augment that with narrative framing and atmosphere and affect, so that a button press is never just a button press in that sense. But there's other ways of dealing with that in terms of expanding the sort of, if you like, the mechanical possibilities of activity, and simply ramifying the number of possible actions that you could imagine doing in the space. And then it becomes a statistical kind of probability thing. And that's where we get this notion of sandboxy or emergent gameplay. There's simply too many action possibilities that even the designer can't account for what might be possible. And in those kinds of spaces, we have very, very strong interactivity. And more than strong interactivity, we also have strong community, which is the other thing I tried to talk about, is that with strong interactivity also comes strong player communities, because players start looking to other players for signals about how an experience can be enjoyed or played or so on and so forth. And the designer becomes less and less important, in fact, at the end of the day.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it there, because I was thinking about, first of all, like zine fandom communities, or like communities where people get really excited about something that's very weakly interactive or not interactive at all, and make entire worlds to interact with it. And I thought, I wonder if this is an edge case. But then I also started thinking about something that I know you know a lot about, which is like mods and people modding games, and people like taking things that are only maybe like a little bit interactive, or I mean, like to put it on the spectrum, you know, that are maybe more shallowly or weakly interactive, and then making them totally magical and interactive and like really immersing in the world. And I'm curious about your opinions on that and like how it fits into the model.
Oh, I mean, that's what I'm getting at. I mean, there are games, I think, that which foreclose that desire. So the desire of a kind of fan creativity, and there are other games which kind of open up that desire. And those are kind of independent of the sort of mechanical interactivity, right? So it can be, as you say, you can get these incredible imaginative worlds and lots of conversation and sort of fan-based creativity in and around a very, if you like, mechanically weak interactivity, a single button press, as well as sort of that kind of explosion of activity that comes with a kind of I guess a designer's deeper or stronger interactivity in terms of I mean, a lot of it has to do also, I think, with the designer's willingness and desire to let it go, to let go of whatever it was that they think they want the players to do, to let the players do whatever they want to do, for good or for bad, you know, from a designer's point of view. And that kind of sort of let it go kind of thing is the opening for the sort of, if you like, interactivity as a precondition for communities, individuals to creatively imagine possibilities, imagine things to do. Games are very much about you know, an endless series of what if scenarios. What if I do that? What if I do that? What if I live this way? What if I, you know, wanted to be this, and what if I wanted to be that? They are imagination producers. The question is how expanded and how open is the design to the imaginations of the various kinds of users that play the games.
Yeah, which I think is something that a lot of artists would be curious about. Just how much control do they want to relinquish? Like, how much is it worth it to build a community? Because I do think, I mean, I think I kind of speculatively agree that having a more open sandbox, imagination delighting universe is going to build a stronger community. I mean, this is the same thing I was arguing, is that like this kind of interactivity in games leads to stronger communities. But I'm curious like about that relationship of control. Like the artist, I think a lot of artists want to control the worlds that they're building. They want to control the experiences that they're building, and a sandbox doesn't allow for that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not an all or it's not all or nothing. I don't think, and even for artists, I don't think it's all or nothing. But it's, if you like it, I guess it's the ultimate gradient. It's one of the tensions that whether you're art making or game designing, you can explore that gradient. How much control, how little control, when to give away control, when to take it back. And the advantage that maybe some games or sort of games production has in a way that a lot of arts makers maybe don't have is this kind of constant push pull with players almost all the way through the game development process. It's actually very rare now to make a game and just ship it and like see what happens. Now games are never finished. They're always being updated. There's new things coming. We say now that games are more of a service than a product. But that service idea of games has to do with the fact, you know, in a crass sense, well, we're going to wait to see what players want to buy, and then we'll give them more of whatever they want to buy. But in the less crass sense, it's about a dialogical relationship between the designers and the players in terms of, oh, wow, we see players imagining these possibilities. Could we give them more resources for doing that? Or, you know, they'd like us to do more of this sort of thing or that sort of thing. And so it's a bit more of a push and pull. So that at the end of the day, it's very hard now, even for AAA companies, it would be pretty hard to locate the design process just in the studio, for instance, and say, well, oh, players they're just consumers. They'll either buy it or they won't, or they play it or they won't. That's kind of an old model, and it doesn't really work with the way the medium works, in fact.
Yeah, which brings me to something that you kind of like alluded to in your interview, which leads nicely from here, but it's around the community shaping the arts and some of the failings. I mean, like certainly we've seen failings of participatory art. You know, Claire Bishop wrote about this really in a really interesting way. You talked about like invested communities having possibly like a bad side or bad side effects. Can you talk about that?
Oh, well, so I mean, I think game cultures are famous for being capable of the most sort of toxic, sort of problematic, difficult, least inclusive kinds of communities that are possible. But part of that comes a little bit with the, if you like, the giving away of control, right? So we see sort of excessive behavior and sort of problematic kind of ways in which communities form inside of game cultures all the time. But also, I have to say, like almost all kinds of cultural communities, there's also everything on the other side, right? So there's nothing about games themselves that lend themselves to kinds of communities one way or the other. But I think the game industry in general is slow to wake up to the fact that the communities are actually part of the games that they make. So even though I'm saying this is how games work, it's not like the industry, the mainstream industry doesn't understand it that way. The mainstream industry comes actually out of much more of a filmmaking model, a Hollywood style studio model than anything else. So they'll do their little focus group tests, and they've got like all their demographics about what different gamers like and so on and so forth. And they'll actually, in a sense, make games that sort of reproduce these kind of categories of what they imagine their audiences to be. And then they're typically completely flummoxed by the fact that their games are never really received the way that they thought they should be. So one of the big things about the game industry is, in fact, it's probably the least predictable kind of economic enterprise of any culture industry. Nobody knows why or when a game will be a hit or anything along those lines. And I think one of the reasons has to do with the communities and lack of control kinds of issues that go on in actual gameplay. And think games that, developers think should be developed completely unproblematic and sort of, joyous types of communities actually produce very hostile, very antagonistic ones that are very destructive for the game itself. And now the industry is waking up to the fact that things like community management are actually part of game design, as opposed to dealing with sort of modulating the behavior of your players so you don't wreck the brand or something like that.
I mean, I want to ask you 1,000 more questions about all of this. I think we might be out of time for our interview, but
that was already fun. We can keep going. Yeah,
we have more time. We can. I love tying money into it, because I feel like you talked a lot about sustainability, about the history of games, the history of people trying to make money from games, and I'm curious if there's anything, like, I know you said it's like a complex landscape, it's ever shifting. But like, what are you looking at? What do you see in the future right now? Like, what do you see us moving towards more of in terms of the economics of games and like sustainability of games?
Depends on what mood I'm in any given day. So it's either really, really bleak or really quite optimistic in terms of how the markets are changing. So on the optimistic side, the market is growing. This is the thing that games get to be happy about, that almost all other cultural sectors get to be jealous about. People are playing more and more games. The pandemic only, exacerbated that. The worry is that the games that people are playing and the games that people desire come from like very few multinational studios, like Disney type studios, effectively reproducing the sort of basic content over and over again. But all evidence points to the fact that that's not the case. So as much as that's going on, the market is growing so much, both in terms of new geographical and cultural segments playing games that weren't playing before, older people who never played games starting to play games, people getting access to game playing technologies like never before. So that, if you like, it's kind of a multiplication of all these market segments. And the big guys, I guess, they're not there in all of these segments at all of these times. And so there's lots of opening for independent creators to create relationships with new kinds of markets, new kinds of audiences, without being overshadowed by these big budget, like super duper games. And so we're seeing a significant economic impact from the indie sector in games. And that's actually growing. So as hard as it is to make a living as an indie game maker, in fact, the market possibilities actually do exist and are expanding. So it's a question of understanding sort of those tensions, and also resisting the bleakness in terms of sort of media policy and other kinds of things that can happen, which kind of destroyed the music industry to some extent. It's not doing wonders for the film industry either. So trying to look at what's going on in terms of the big picture political economy around these platforms and things like that are super, super important. And then looking at games for ideas about how that could possibly be resisted, because at least in the game sector, there's a sort of modicum of success that might be pointed to.
Yeah, I mean, you're speaking directly to my lived experience right now, so thank you. And let's not have like a Spotify of games, like let's not go. It's awful. It's awful. Yeah, I think it's time for me to disappear. So with that, I'll just mute myself and say goodbye for now.
Pleasure.
Well, that was such an interesting conversation, especially the concept of gamer community, because we know we're so immersed into community engagement. So just the fact that that exists as well is so interesting. I would now like to call Sara on to our virtual stage to join Bart.
Hello.
Hello, Sara. Nice entry. Oh,
we have fun here.
All right, let's get started to the next round. I could keep talking about the last round. I didn't realize my head would be doing this. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, your thought piece picks up already on tons of stuff that we've just been talking about. So I'm going to spin it around and kind of just keep the conversation going. I think one of the big things that you're talking about a lot in your thought piece is the kind of overlaps and crossovers between sort of arts making and games making. But I think one of the things I wanted to get your thoughts about is what I feel is a sort of lingering stigma around being in games or being interested in games in an arts community, arts industry contexts.
Absolutely.
Do you think there's stigma left? I mean, there certainly was, but and what's the nature? Why? What's going on with the resistance to being gamey in the arts?
I think that's a great question. We're making we have made a lot of great progress towards dissipating that stigma, right? We've had these blockbuster exhibitions at the Victoria and Albert Museum and at the Smithsonian Museum about games and their cultural impact. However, as you say, there is still the stigma around games, and I think that there is a tendency to think of games as childish things, to think of them as overly violent, competitive, and also like a lot of art takes itself very seriously because it's tied up in a lot of power, right? So like capital, power, church, less so church now, but government as well, but also just, you know, mostly the buying and selling and commodification of art. So that's very, very serious. It's not necessarily a joyful or recreational practice. So I think that that's part of what perpetuates that stigma. Also, you know, part of in creating that idea of value is the idea that there can be a one singular object. So when you have a multiplicity of something, it really challenges the monetary value of that thing. So that's kind of part of why games get that side eye. But also, if you look at the most kind of ubiquitous representations of what games are, you know, it's going to be in commercials and adverts, and the kind of games you see usually marketed commercially are still going to be those kind of fighty, racy, shooty games a lot of the time. So that doesn't necessarily help either, but that's because those are the games that have a large amount of marketing budget allocated to them. So that doesn't particularly help. However, conversations like these, people like you and Marie are working across sectors, across disciplines to kind of break up that stigma. So I'm quite hopeful about that in the future.
So let's think a bit more about sort of, so this is the other element of the thought piece, something about, you know, game makers and their audiences. Marie was asking me about it, but you have your own take on it and a lot of direct experience and sort of thinking how game makers deal with audiences. But what I'm interested is, especially for this crowd, sort of, I mean, if we imagine, you know, lessons like takeaways, you know, what do game makers do right with respect to audiences? That, I mean, and you've talked, you kind of mentioned this about in terms of how galleries might think differently, but I'm also thinking in terms of artists themselves, let alone arts organizations, in terms of how audiences might be conceived of differently.
Absolutely. I mean, I think often it can be too easy to think about an audience as a body through a door paying admission, which of course is impossible to not think of in a moment in which arts organizations are so pressed financially. And it's really tricky. Anytime you ask someone to be good at more than one thing, I think it's kind of not fair. So if you're an art historian or you're other type of museum professional, asking them to suddenly understand audience research methodologies is a whole other question, because that is like a very sophisticated field of study in and of itself, right? So I think our understandings of what audience research can be often be quite limited to, like, here's a survey monkey, you know, like here's a button you can press when you come in and out of the exhibition. Whereas if you're a game designer, you will be more likely during your testing process before our project goes live, be thinking about the player experience from beginning to end, as opposed to at a one fixed moment before or after someone's exhibition experience. So, and game designers are trained in their own types of quantitative and qualitative evaluation, right? So like, how many people are actually able to finish this level? And that's your quant. And was it fun? These are both really important types of evaluation. Of course, fun is almost, there's a whole other, as you know, in game study, it's a very complicated question to think about a measure, but I think it's really important for folks in the arts sectors to learn more and think about and play more with qualitative evaluation methods. And there's a whole, as I mentioned, academic field related to this, but also the design studio Frog has some nice resources online about how to do that as well.
So do you have a sense how you could pitch that where it didn't sound like something that so this is my experience, right?
Yeah.
It just sounds like something marketing is telling artists to do. Oh, you should test that latest song with you should, but you and I both know that, independent of marketing, to make a game is very much involves doing constant and steady user testing. Often, in spite of the fact that you have no time, you have no money or whatever, but nevertheless, it's still super, super important. You can't make the game without it. But there's this, again, is a stigma or is just an assumption that if somebody tells you you need to care what somebody else thinks, it must be marketing that said so.
You're getting at something very important. And if you were a game designer, yes, you might have your friends who are a game designer test your game. That game designer is going to give you very, very different feedback as opposed to someone who is not in the games industry. And if you are an artist and you are in art school, or if your friends are other artists and you're doing a studio crit, the feedback they give you is going to be very different than the audience feedback you get. And I think, I don't think it's so much of a stretch intellectually to consider the fact, like, just like your peers can give you feedback that improves the quality of your practice, if you decide you are to be a community engaged artist or audience focus with an artist with an audience engaged practice, it is not so unusual. And oh man, there's a really amazing dance company in Texas, and I believe they're called Chairlift, and they do all of this really amazing collaborative stuff. And they have a researcher embedded in their collective. So they're not just doing the dances, they're not just like doing the community participation, but they have someone gathering data that not only helps them make better art, but also helps them succeed with grant applications. Because if you ever sat on a board for arts funding, you know that eval is a huge, huge, huge part of it. So that's another,
super interesting,
really positive incentive as well, to just be like, oh, how can we measure the impact of your art? Because funders are always going to want to know that. And it's a really hard question.
All right, so now on to the part I really want to talk about, because it's where you and I have a really good discussion somewhere down the road. But you spent a fair amount of time talking about the synergies between thinking about games and what you had called like sort of playful approaches in art. But in fact, it's I'm not sure it's really just that, right? So whether it's Fluxus, durational art, or so on and so forth, what struck me and is actually starting to influence me a little bit in terms of the question about what's essential about games, or why are games special. I now actually think, based on what you're already starting to think, given that long history, that games are simply a continuation of that tradition, whether it's the Fluxus tradition and situationist tradition. And we did say all video games fall into that kind of category, because what's being produced essentially, it's a experience design, right, which is limited in time and space to the moment in which it's being played. So I wonder if you could just talk more about that. I mean, that's just a straight, strong thesis, right? Games are an extension of durational art.
I mean, I'm not opposed to that statement. However, I would say, especially if you're thinking about folks like the situationists or Fluxus, that it's systems design that is deliberately crafted to undermine or subvert a dominant or pervasive system, right? Whereas if you look at those games I was talking about earlier, the games that people are going to roll their eyes at, that are not particularly interesting to me, I think those reinforce a positive, or rather like a particularly pervasive paradigm that is not positive. And like, as we know from early childhood studies, like play is how people rehearse being in the world very often, but it's also, as we both know, a way to imagine alternative futures and alternative possibilities. So yeah, we can think about play as a way to experience across the board, but also a particular behavioral action and a series of choices that I think a designer can choose to make normative or not normative, or somewhere in the middle.
I think that's where this all needs to go, right? Because that subversive element which defined the character of the kind of durational art situationists and so on that you're talking about, we always talk about as being woefully sort of missing, or at least a minority in games. But if games makers started thinking of themselves in terms of that tradition, the tools themselves aren't any different. I think that's part of what you're saying.
Absolutely. I like that you put that together, because that's helpful for me. And of course, we can't be too heavy-handed with it either. It is an artful skill to craft an experience, because if you feel like you don't have a particular amount of agency, if you feel like you're being fed a particular, like an amount of dogma, like so many games that we might see in the games for change category, that's not that doesn't particularly make the player feel like they have a lot of choice. That's not a particularly pleasant experience a lot of the time either. But of course, I would not blame any game designer if they do not want to mess with the A word, because a lot of people who work in games want a career. They want to make money. And I think, dollars is a really big factor, I think, in determining the arts versus industry models. But there's middle ground.
All right, well, we could talk about that forever. We have time for maybe one more thing. I do think it's important, one of the things that games bring to the discussion in the arts sector, have before and will in the future, is the question of discoverability. You talked about it a little bit, and I wonder, basically you said discoverability is hard no matter what, but I'm wondering if there's some lessons there from your experience to pass on to especially arts organizations on whom the job of discoverability for artists falls. So I wonder if there's any quick hints or thoughts around that.
I think, it's important for curators and institutions to take responsibility for the power that comes along with, recommending or highlighting or showcasing a particular artwork, artist, game, etc. Look at Guerrilla Girls, a really amazing collective of artists who draw attention to the kind of historical biases that exists within institutional recommendations for artwork. So take that responsibility very, very seriously in terms of spotlighting not just games that you think are critical or worth highlighting for their artistic merit, but games created by people of the global majority, games created by women, games created by non-binary and folks across the LGBTQ spectrum. I think understanding that is also quite important. And also, understanding that not everyone has the same level of fluency when it comes to engaging with games. So taking that really responsibly in terms of thinking about how to onboard someone into a game. So are you going to be asking people to use a dual stick controller right away? If so, how are you teaching people how to use that? Or my preference is to work with games that avoid controllers altogether. And that's a whole other conversation we can have, but not just think about showcasing the experience of the game itself, but how you're getting people in and out of those experiences in a way that makes them feel safe and empowered.
Very cool. And I think it's time for me to leave.
Thanks so much, Bart.
Conversation.
Thank you so much, Bart, for that. And now I'd like to invite Marie back to join Sara on our virtual stage.
Thank you.
Welcome back, Marie. So as you know, I have loads of questions for you. I loved what you had to say. I'm a big fan of your work. You, like me, work across many different disciplines, and you wear a whole bunch of different hats. And as you have moved through those roles in your career and moved through those kind of sectors and projects, are there any kind of like core values or uniting themes that kind of motivate your work as you move through those spaces?
I have never, believe it or not, actually sat down and thought about this in this way, in the way that you just asked. But definitely yes. The second you said it, I said definitely, absolutely yes. There's been a focus throughout my work. Like my background was in like communities. I did alternative education with like under-resourced youth. I did arts organizing. And then I started making experimental video games. And throughout all that work, some core themes have been like connection, finding ways to bring people together, and expression, finding ways to help people, including myself, express our art. I don't know, I feel like all the words for the thing I want to say next have been like de-juiced or like de-blooded or something, but like I want to say something about like compassion or empathy or like empathy is funny. It's like this beautiful word that's been like totally sucked dry. It's like a shriveled husk now. It's not, but something around that, around like this kind of connection and like shared existence, and also like a playfulness. And then finally something around like DIY, like do it yourself, and DIT, do it together, communities where people are trying to do things despite not having the resources, despite not having the like the official education, despite not having much support. People just trying their best to make something with what they have.
I love that, and that's a beautiful. And to me, hearing you say that, I mean, what I hear is a lot about power, right? So like sharing power, discovering power, and I think that's really beautiful. And I mean, if you think about your work with institutions, like, you know, like arts institutions or museums, those are loci of power, right? And sometimes not in a particularly like generous or reciprocal kind of way, although I know that everyone here in the conversation is very, very invested in creating really equitable and just and sometimes even joyful spaces. So, but I would love to hear from you a little bit about, you know, in your experience working with cultural institutions or arts organizations, what are some of the barriers you face as a person who's interested in facilitating the kinds of experiences you just described?
Yeah, certainly working with institutions has been almost universally a negative experience, despite meeting wonderful people and having lovely connections with specific individuals. It's almost always dehumanizing. The people I'm working with are almost always overworked and underpaid, and they're trying to like squeeze value out of things without actually compensating people like me or the people that I'm working with fairly. So it's like, let's extract value from this specific community, which seems to exist. I mean, like maybe that's a very ungenerous way of looking at it. And the individuals, again, have been very kind, but the institutions are not designed for this kind of work. They're not designed for grassroots work. They're not designed for people without the right degrees or, I don't know, like accomplishments and awards on their CVs. And they're extremely exclusive and like only seem to welcome certain kinds of people. Like that has been my experience. Of course, with exceptions. You know, I did a residency at the NYU Game Center 2 years ago. I would have thought this was impossible. Usually universities, and I did a residency at TAG at Milieu, where Bart is. And I would have thought this was impossible. I mean, I have an undergraduate degree, but I stopped there. And I find educational institutions often like look for people who have the right kinds of paper for that. It's already competitive enough. And museums look for people with the right kind of papers for that. And it's like, it's very challenging. It's been mostly challenges.
Yeah, well, we're coming back to that quantitative versus qualitative evaluation question again, aren't we? Sometimes that can feel pretty gross, but like it's good to know that there have been exceptions, and like, gosh, universities are almost the worst of the worst in terms of silo and bureaucracy. So it's great to hear that you've had some positive experiences there. And of course, universities play such an important role in, shaping how we think about our disciplines and shaping also what we rebel against within our disciplines. But something you and Bart were talking about was like the role of community and of course, and your work with Gaia, right, which is a community in and of itself of designers. And so I'd love to hear, we all know about the yucky parts of games discourse, right? We know about the bad behavior and the yucky boys on the internet. To you, what might a healthier or more positive discourse around games look like? What kind of like resources or channels or questions might facilitate something like that?
Oh, wow. I love this. First, I want to say, in case someone doesn't know, because it's possible. I mean, some people are outside of the scope, and I just want to say that games definitely, as Bart alluded to, have some of the most toxic, awful communities imaginable. I mean, there are people who just dedicate their entire lives, like literally, they'll see something that they don't like. Oh, this game has queer representation. And then I'm speaking about a specific studio. This studio made a beautiful game, a beautiful queer game, and then have been targeted, vilified, attacked, forced off the internet, people making fake copies of their game that are totally inappropriate. People get swatted, their houses, police come to their house in the middle of the night. Like, it is like not good. It is extremely, very, 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 very bad. So I just want to, in case people don't know, it is absolutely a nightmare. And people who exist in my communities they're not in that community, but that community comes for them. So, people get death threats and this sort of thing. It's like, so yeah, I just want to, like, in case people don't know how bad it is, I wanted to emphasize that. But as to a future, I mean, certainly diversity of expression is really important. I think we're not going to get anywhere if we don't represent the people. As you said, Sarah, like, we need to represent the people who are here. We need to make space for different voices and not be so reactionary. So like, make space for mistakes, make space for experimentation. I love experiment. I'm all about experimentation, and something that I feel like people need to know about experimentation is that it's going to fail as much or more than it succeeds. Like, it's just, experimentation is about failing and about like making happy mistakes, but also making bad mistakes. And so I imagine like a future of games discourse, making room for mistakes, making room for experimentation, and above all, like, for me, funding resources, funding spaces, funding communities where people can emerge, because I really am like not on board with some of the funding models we have now, whether it's like games publishers or grants, are like, let's identify the shining stars and we'll highlight them and give them all the monies and all the opportunities. And it's like, this is not how it works. Like, people, both when I worked in music and zines and arts and games, people come out of communities. So funding communities, funding community resources is where you make magic, in my opinion.
I love it. What a beautiful answer. What a delight to speak with you. I love what you had to say in your thought piece about the role of feedback and testing in your process. And to just kind of, harken back to what Bart and I were talking about, I'd love to know more about, like, what are some of the qualitative metrics that you test for when you're testing whether or not a game is successful, or what you might want to change when you're in a design process?
Yeah, I feel like we could have an amazing conversation about testing, the three of us. Like, we could just cancel all other conversations and just talk about testing, because it's core to everything. I mean, Bart was talking about this. You were talking about, it's like games are an interactive medium. Like, as Bart said, games come to life when people play them. And for me as a game designer, I mean, there are exceptions. There are people who work in different ways. But like, for me as a game designer, and for many of the game designers I work with, we start with some kind of idea or core or question or thought. And then immediately there's testing. Like, we jump into testing long before any other arts field that I know of would jump into testing. And before I talk about like what I test for, I also want to say, which we talked to, I think it was you, Sarah, that said it earlier, about who is testing the game is really important. Like, you don't want just anyone testing. Like, are the people testing it the people that you actually want to reach? Is like so key. So many people test on their partner. Like, they're just like, oh, this person lives with me, or this is my roommate. And you can get very interesting feedback, but it's not, yeah. So first, who's testing? And then second, like, what do you test? I mean, I test a lot for things that are like a little bit hard to, like they're a little bit intangible. Like I test for like feelings of like flow or joy or sadness or whatever it is that I'm trying to activate. There's a lot of intuitive stuff happening when I'm playtesting with people. And my favorite way to play test is to get people to just live stream of conscious, narrate what they're experiencing, which of course brings them out of the experience a little bit, but for me, it's worth it to get what I can get. And I dream of having better testing in the future where I have like more data. Like I dream of like surveys and numbers and things that can fit into boxes. But so far in my practice, like I just don't, I'm like often working alone with almost no money or with very little money. And it's like not, I'm under-resourced. So like I can't get meaningful amounts of data. But I have been working with a studio recently that's doing a lot of like they're doing kind of like the qualitative interview testing, and then they're doing this thing which Bart probably knows so much more about, being in academia, and maybe you do too, I have no idea, but like they're coding, so they're translating this information into a structure, which then you can use to like ask better questions or understand understand what kind of information you're dealing with.
That's so cool.
I don't know, I'm curious. I love testing. It's the most important part of my practice, I would say. And like Bart said earlier, I mean, I keep echoing Bart. I feel like I'm echoing Bart, but also echoing my earlier interview and also echoing every conversation we've ever had. Testing is like, it is game development, and like testing with the right people. So your community is like a process that begins and doesn't really end. Like your community continues to be the thing that brings your game to life. And it's this like weird organic living thing.
I love that. And you know, thinking about your community, how do you figure out where people are at? Like when you're thinking about an audience you're designing for, like what are your kind of methods? What kind of questions are you asking? What kind of like things are you trying to feel out in order to assess like the state of your audience?
Yeah, that's a big question. That's a really good big question. So, I mean, a lot of the time these days, because there's no money for me as like someone designing experimental art games, like the funding for games is either funding for games or it's funding for arts. And I find myself often like too much in neither camp. So when I think about this audience development lately, it's like me working as a consultant for people. And yeah, when I'm thinking about their audiences, I usually ask a lot of questions around who are they trying to reach? What are these people like? And then I don't know. Sometimes I do things like personas, like this kind of like UX background. I don't know if that's familiar to people. Type of exploration and experimentation. But often it's like this very organic process. Like you're working with an artist or you're working with a community, and it's a lot more about listening than talking. Like it's a lot more about like pulling in what exists, and then also like looking at the edges, like the fraying edges of that to like what could be. So maybe your audience is a certain type or certain group of people, but maybe you want to grow into somewhere else. And it's like looking at those people. Where are they showing up? What physical spaces do they occupy? What online spaces are they occupying? What are they doing in those spaces? What are they looking for? What are they dreaming of? And this is like, I don't know, going back to something that was said earlier, this is a hard conversation sometimes because as an artist, like I have a vision anyways when I'm making art. And there's always like, okay, how much am I just speaking my truth? And how much am I looking at my community and understanding what they need to hear? Like this process of translation, if you overcompensate, if you do too much for the community, you can end up totally disconnected from the thing yourself and just like making something for whoever happened to show up. So there's a strange balance there between like making your vision, but translating it for the people that you want to reach in a way that they can hear.
Absolutely. And I agree completely. And I guess I'll wrap up with one final question. What's the number one thing you want arts workers and arts organizations to know about games?
I want them to know that games are art. I just want them to know that games are art. I want to stop writing these things at the bottom of my grant applications that say this is why this is an art. I want to stop having conversations with people after every art show I go to. I go talk to my peers and I say, oh, I make experimental video games. And like 9 out of 10 conversations are the person like completely getting turned off. Oh no, not 9. 7 out of 10 are the person being like, oh, I don't like games, or like, oh, my son plays Minecraft, or like, yeah, I play Bejeweled, but I'm embarrassed about it, or something like this. Like, and then a few of the conversations are people being like, I love Call of Duty. Do you make Call of Duty? And I'm like, no, I don't make Call of Duty. And I just wish that there was like more space here. Like in music, there's definitely the space. Like you can make like weird experimental music that is just minutes of silence, you know, like that was like so long ago already, you know, and like people are like, yeah, okay, that's music. Or like someone can like tinker around on like pots and pans, and we're like, okay, that's music. And I wish games would get that far. Yeah, and that we would expand. Like there's so much room for things to be games, like as infinite as the kinds of play people did when they were kids, like from like singing in a made up language to like playing with garbage in your pocket to like hopscotch to climbing trees, like all the different things that kids did as play. Like there's as many grown up versions of that we can experiment with and more. So it's like really sad to me when I see people seeing games as like limited to like 4 different types of things. And like really constraining the space.
There's a polyphony of play. Fantastic. Well, Marie, thank you so much for chatting with me. I look forward to many more chats with you, and thanks so much to everyone for inviting us to have this conversation.
Thanks, Sarah. I love talking to you.